The house was never just walls and a roof. It was never simply bricks stacked upon mortar or timber shaped into shelter. From the very beginning, from the first moment humanity chose permanence over movement, it was a silent contract between the individual and power. It was an unspoken agreement, written not in ink, but in blood, sweat, and submission. The moment humans stopped wandering the earth as nomads and chose to settle, to stake their claim on a piece of land, the question fundamentally shifted. It was no longer merely where we live, but who allows us to live there, who grants permission, who can take it away. In the earliest civilizations, along the fertile rivers of the Tigris, Euphrates, and Nile, where agriculture first flourished and surplus first accumulated, land and housing did not belong to those who worked it or built upon it. They belonged to those who controlled surplus and authority, to those who commanded armies and priests, to those who held the keys to the granaries and the temples. In ancient Mesopotamia, one of humanity's first experiments in organized society, homes were granted and withdrawn by decree, their ownership recorded on clay tablets that differ little in spirit from modern bank contracts and mortgage documents. The language has changed, the medium has evolved from clay to digital code, but the essence remains identical. Housing was not a right then, and it is not truly a right now. It was a conditional privilege, granted to those who obeyed, who served, who knew their place in the hierarchy. Step out of line, question authority, fail to pay tribute, and you stepped out of your home. The equation was simple and brutal. In ancient Egypt, where order appeared eternal and unchanging, where pharaohs ruled as living gods and time itself seemed frozen in stone, housing was woven directly into the hierarchy of power. The geography of residence was not accidental, but designed. Near temples and palaces lived those with influence, those connected to the throne, the priests, the scribes, the administrators who kept the machinery of empire functioning. Meanwhile, the rest occupied the margins, the outskirts, the forgotten neighborhoods where the sun beat harder and the floodwaters came less predictably. There was no free housing market, no competition, no choice in any meaningful sense, but there was absolute control over who lived where and why. Every dwelling was assigned, every location calculated. A home was a declaration of status, each brick a marker of one's place in the rigid system. Each door told a story of power or powerlessness. This logic never disappeared from human civilization. It never faded into history. It only evolved, became more sophisticated, learned to hide itself better. When civilization reached Greece and Rome, when philosophy and law supposedly triumphed over barbarism, property appeared more liberal, more democratic, more enlightened. But in truth, it became more deceptive, more insidious in its inequalities. In Athens, the birthplace of democracy itself, full citizenship quietly required owning a home within the city walls. Without property, you were not truly a citizen. Your voice did not count. Your participation was conditional. In Rome, the greatest empire the ancient world had ever seen, the city filled with towering apartment blocks called insulae, where the poor rented cramped spaces, dark rooms without ventilation or sanitation, while the wealthy monopolized real land, sprawling villas with gardens and marble fountains. Millions lived stacked upon one another, with no housing security, no stability, completely at the mercy of landlords who could raise rents at will or evict without warning. The scene feels disturbingly familiar to anyone living in a modern city. The architecture has improved, but the relationship has not. Only the names have changed. Only the illusion of progress persists. Then came the Middle Ages, when the truth was stated openly, without pretense or euphemism. The land belonged to the noble, granted by divine right or conquest. The house belonged to the land, an extension of the Lord's domain. And the person belonged to the house, bound to it by law and custom, unable to leave without permission. No ownership, no movement, no stability without permission from above. Housing was direct control, naked and undisguised. Feudalism did not hide its nature, it proclaimed it. With the rise of commercial cities in the later Middle Ages, as trade routes expanded and merchant classes emerged, things began to change. Not for justice, not for equality, but for profit. Houses became assets that could be traded. Assets could be sold, mortgaged, inherited, used as collateral for loans. Here, in these medieval marketplaces, the seed of the greatest modern illusion was planted, the idea that housing could be both a human need and a commodity, both a home and an investment, both shelter and speculation. The Industrial Revolution detonated that illusion with devastating force. Millions flooded into cities not by choice, not by opportunity, but by necessity and desperation. The enclosures had driven them from the land. Factories demanded labor, endless streams of bodies to feed the machines. Cities demanded those bodies, absorbing them into slums and tenements, but no one cared where those bodies slept, how they lived, whether they survived. Renting became the norm, the default condition for the working class. Overcrowding became normal, accepted, expected. Families of 10 crammed into single rooms. Disease spread like wildfire through airless streets. The home lost its meaning as refuge, as sanctuary. It became merely the place where you collapsed after 14 hours in the factory. Yet hope still existed, fragile but real. In the 19th century, despite the horror of industrial capitalism, workers believed that owning a home, though difficult, was still possible. Prices were tied to labor, to actual wages, not to abstract speculation or global capital flows. If you worked hard enough, saved long enough, you might one day own your dwelling. The 20th century brought the great promise, the social contract that seemed to change everything. After 2 world wars that had destroyed empires and killed millions, after revolutions and uprisings that terrified the ruling classes, governments finally realized that a person without a home is a dangerous person. A person with nothing to lose has everything to gain from revolution. Anger needs a place to stand, but it also needs to be pacified, controlled, redirected. So home ownership was promoted as a social stabilizer, as a way to give workers a stake in the system, a reason to defend it. In the United States, the house became a national symbol, the centerpiece of the American dream. In Europe, housing security became part of the social contract, the welfare state's promise to its citizens. Mortgages spread, becoming accessible to ordinary people for the first time in history. Suburbs expanded, transforming farmland into endless rows of modest homes, and people were convinced the system worked for them, that capitalism had been tamed, that prosperity would be shared. By the 1960s, the middle class could realistically own homes. Teachers, factory workers, nurses, clerks, all could aspire to ownership. The dream felt real because it was real, at least for a generation. What was never said, what was carefully hidden, is that this dream was temporary, bound to an exceptional historical moment. It existed only because capital had been weakened by war and constrained by strong labor movements and socialist threats. Once global capital regained its strength, once unions were broken and regulations dismantled, it began reclaiming what it had temporarily given. Quietly, without announcement, without debate, the rules changed. Homes stopped being primarily places to live and became containers of wealth, vehicles for accumulation, instruments of class reproduction. By the late 20th century, banks entered the housing market with unprecedented aggression, then investment funds, then pension funds, then borderless capital flowing from tax havens and oligarchs. A house became a line in a portfolio, an asset class, completely disconnected from human life and human need. In the 21st century, the illusion fully collapsed for anyone willing to see clearly. Prices exploded upward, detached from any economic reality. Wages stagnated, held down by globalization and automation. The gap widened into a chasm. What once required 3 years of average income now required 10, 15, 20 years. In cities like London, New York, Paris, Vancouver, Sydney, San Francisco, the question was no longer how hard you work, how educated you are, how valuable your labor. The question became where you come from, what class you were born into, who supports you, what you will inherit.
Young people today work more hours than their parents, with more education, more productivity, yet own less than any generation in a century. Rent consumes their lives, eating 30, 40, 50% of their income, and ownership retreats year after year, becoming more distant, more impossible, more absurd. Then came the most dangerous player of all, the final evolution of housing as capital. The investor who does not live in the property and never intends to live there. The corporation that buys not to use but to hold. An empty apartment became more profitable than an occupied one, because occupation means maintenance, means dealing with humans, means wear and tear. In some cities, thousands upon thousands of housing units sit vacant, bought and locked away simply to drive prices upward, to create artificial scarcity. Supply is deliberately strangled not by actual shortage, but by strategic hoarding. The market is managed like any scarce commodity, like gold or diamonds, though housing is neither rare nor precious. It can be built, it can be created. The home, once celebrated as the foundation of social stability, became a financial weapon, a tool for extracting wealth from those who have none. The cruel paradox that nobody wants to acknowledge is that the world now has more houses than people who need them, yet access is systematically blocked. In relatively poor countries, in places we're told are backward or underdeveloped, home ownership rates exceed 90%. Meanwhile, in the richest cities on Earth and the capitals of global finance and innovation, ownership becomes an elite privilege, restricted to the top 20 or 10%. Not because land is genuinely scarce, we have more land than ever, but because access is controlled, gate-kept, turned into a mechanism for sorting winners from losers. The system is not broken. That's the hardest truth to swallow. It is functioning exactly as designed, achieving precisely what it was meant to achieve. And so the cycle closes, returning to where it began millennia ago. As in ancient Babylon, as in imperial Rome, as under feudalism, housing returns as a tool of social sorting, a marker of who matters and who doesn't. Those who own are stable, secure, their lives predictable. Those who do not remain suspended, precarious, one crisis away from homelessness. The difference today is that control is invisible, wrapped in the neutral language of markets, freedom, and choice. No one explicitly forbids you from buying. No law prevents your ownership. The conditions alone, the prices, the credit scores, the down payments, the generational wealth requirements are enough to exclude you forever. And if you complain, if you question, you're told you simply didn't work hard enough, didn't save enough, didn't make the right choices. Homeownership is no longer just an economic issue, reducible to interest rates and supply-demand curves. It is fundamentally a question of power, of who controls society and how. Those who own land control time itself, their futures secure, their children's futures guaranteed. Those who do not live in temporary presence, signing leases that can be terminated, working unstable jobs that can vanish overnight, living lives that can be erased at any moment by forces beyond their control. The unspoken question hanging over our entire civilization is this: is this a failure of the system or its greatest success? Is the housing crisis a bug or a feature? History does not answer our questions clearly. It whispers, offering only fragments and warnings. Every civilization that turned housing into a commodity, that treated shelter as speculation, eventually paid the price in instability, in collapse, in revolution. Every society that used homes as instruments of control and division eventually fell apart. Rome crumbled, feudalism burned. But the only difference now is the scale of the game and its terrifying speed. We are not simply living through a housing crisis, as politicians and economists would have us believe. We are living through a redefinition of what it means to be human in the 21st century. Are we beings who need shelter, who deserve dignity and security? Or are we merely numbers that need loans, data points and an algorithm, assets to be extracted? And history, as always, is watching in silence, waiting to see what we will do.